All right, we're continuing our discussion of progressivism at the local and state level. The last thing we talked about were voter registration laws and the secret ballot, things to create a more virtuous electorate. Progressives promoted laws that expressly were designed to keep non-citizen immigrants from voting. In the 1880s, 18 states passed laws allowing immigrants to vote without first becoming citizens. Why? Because it benefited the political machines. Progressives reversed this trend. At the same time, the new Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization, which came online in 1906, made it more difficult to become a citizen. Applicants now had to appear before a judge who quizzed them in English on American history and civics. They also had to provide 2 witnesses to vouch for their, quote, moral character, unquote. Finally, immigrants had to swear that they were not anarchists or polygamists and had resided continuously in the U.S. for 5 years. Most progressives defended the rigor of this process. U.S. citizenship carried responsibilities. The position was reasonable given the voting abuses that progressives had exposed. But the reforms also had the effect of denying the vote to a large proportion of the population. In cities where immigrants dominated the workforce, the number of registered voters fell alarmingly. Nowhere was this disenfranchisement trend more startling than in the South, where beginning in the 1890s through about 1905, every former Confederate state passed laws to strip blacks of their vote. This was, of course, accomplished indirectly, things like poll taxes and so forth. These efforts also disenfranchised a considerable number of poor whites. Alabama, for example, our current Constitution, which is a train wreck, was passed in 1901 with the express purpose of disenfranchising black people and poor whites, the majority of the population of Alabama. Many progressives in the North, such as Governor Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, bitterly criticized Southern disenfranchisement. Some, including John Dewey and Jane Addams, joined in 1910 with W.E.B. Du Bois and other black reformers to found the NAACP. Southern progressives had no problem with all this, just as Northern progressives had no problem with disenfranchising many immigrants, people they felt who were unfit to vote. The major exception to disenfranchisement of the era was the enfranchisement of women with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. This women's rights movement was launched in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. You may have learned about that last year. But it floundered in the 1870s, 1880s. The movement in 1890, however, got a big boost with the formation of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NALSA, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Thousands of young college-educated women campaigned door-to-door, held rallies, and pressured their state legislators. Wyoming, which became a state in 1890, was the first to grant women the right to vote, followed quickly by Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. Notice the leaders were in the West. There was conviction in these states that women's supposedly gentler nature would tame and civilize the rawness of the frontier. This was ironically sexist. Suffragists were slow to ally themselves with blacks, Asians, and other disenfranchised groups, especially in the South. Unlike the suffrage pioneers of the 1840s and 50s, many progressive-era suffragists were little troubled by racial discrimination or injustice. Other Western states followed suit. After a series of setbacks in Eastern and Midwestern states, the movement regained momentum under the able leadership of Carrie Chapman Catt, who became president of NALSA in 1915. Equally important was Alice Paul, a radical who founded the Congressional Union in 1913 and later renamed it the National Woman's Party. Paul and her supporters focused their attention on the White House, picketing Woodrow Wilson 24 hours a day. Several suffrage demonstrators were jailed, where they continued to protest by going on hunger strikes. Aided by America's participation in World War I, which heightened enthusiasm for democracy, the suffragists achieved their goal of universal woman suffrage in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. In some states, progressive reform extended well beyond the political parties and the electorate. Progressives also wanted to limit corporate power, strengthen organized labor, and offer social welfare protection to the weak. State governments were pressured into making such reforms by an alliance of middle-class and working-class reformers and by dynamic governors. Wisconsin was the scene of the greatest progressive reform. The movement there was first arose in the 1890s in hundreds of Wisconsin cities and towns as citizens mobilized against the state's corrupt Republican Party and the special privileges that the party had given to private utilities and railroads. These reformers had varied backgrounds, middle and working class, urban and rural, male and female, intellectual, evangelical, Protestant, Scandinavian, German Catholic. Wisconsin progressivism had already gained momentum by the time that Robert La Follette assumed the leadership of the movement there in 1897. La Follette will be a major progressive figure. He's also known as Fightin' Bob La Follette. La Follette entered politics as a Republican in the 1880s, embraced reform in the 1890s, and became governor in 1890. As governor, he secured a direct primary and tax law that stripped the railroads of tax exemptions. In 1905, he pushed through a civil service reform for Wisconsin requiring every state employee to have a minimum level of competence. A tireless campaigner, an excellent speaker, Fightin' Bob was elected to the Senate, the U.S. Senate, in 1906. Meanwhile, the growth of labor and socialism in Wisconsin focused reformers there to focus on corporate welfare and greed. By 1910, reformers had passed legislation that regulated railroads and utilities, implemented the first state income tax, provided workers with compensation for injuries, set limits on work hours, restricted child labor, and set minimum wages for women. Many of these laws were written by social scientists at the University of Wisconsin, with whom reformers had close ties. In the first decade of the 20th century, a guy named John Commons, University of Wisconsin economist, drafted much of Wisconsin's civil service and public utilities laws. In 1911, Commons united employers, unions, and professionals and gave them broad powers to regulate industrial relations with labor in something called the Wisconsin Industrial Commission. The commission delegated powers to non-elected experts. So we have now non-elected experts drafting and writing laws which progressive legislatures then pass. Wisconsin reformers hoped that all these scientists, lawyers, and engineers and others who played a role in creating all this reform legislation would give the public expert and honest government, something at which the political parties had failed. This Wisconsin idea, as it was known, was quickly adopted in New York, Colorado. In 1913, the federal government created its own Industrial Relations Commission and hired Commons to direct it. So we now have a more complex society, complex problems. We therefore need complex laws. And one way we can write these laws is to employ delegated experts to bring the efficiency of scientific management to the legislative process. Second only to Wisconsin in reform was New York. And so I want to talk about reform efforts there to wrap up, even though my slide says Wisconsin progressivism. Just ignore that. New Yorkers wanted to end political corruption and after revelations of ties between leading Republicans and insurance companies. And that scandal vaulted the reform lawyer Charles Evans Hughes into the governor's seat in 1907. Charles Evans Hughes is a very important American. He's one of those famous Americans who was almost president that you don't know about, but you probably should. Hughes established public service commissions to regulate railroads and utilities. As in Wisconsin, labor got a stronger voice. New York City garment workers struck and forced the state legislature to treat working conditions more seriously. With the establishment of the Factory Investigating Committee, New York, like Wisconsin, became a pioneer in labor and social welfare policy. New York legislators also faced pressure from middle-class reformers like a settlement house worker named Lillian Wald and Louis Brandeis, whose work with the poor had convinced them that the law must promote social justice. This combined working-class and middle-class pressure led some Democrats, like Assemblyman Alfred E. Smith and Robert F. Wagner, to convert from machine to reform politics. Alfred Smith, here in the center, is a particularly important New Yorker. He will actually be the Democratic nominee for president in 1920, the first Catholic to be so. So he came up through Tammany Hall. So did Wagner, and they got themselves elected to the state legislature. But they sort of see the light. And retaining the immigrant working class support, they become more progressive-minded. Wagner and Smith were both Catholics, and their presence in the ranks of reformers invigorated and extended the movement. They opposed prohibition, city commissions, and voter registration. Why? Because they were pro-immigrant. But they supported reforms to improve living and working conditions for New York City's urban poor. They campaigned for a minimum wage, factory safety, workmen's compensation, union rights, and the regulation of powerful corporations. Their participation in progressivism accelerated the shift away from a preoccupation with political parties and electorates toward questions of economic justice and social welfare.